Wait a second, I know what you're doing. You're going to scroll to the end of this tier list video and just look at the completed tier list with no context and then maybe leave a nasty comment if you don't like what you see. Well, you put that finger down, Timmy, because this tier list is not for high-end world first level keys. This is a tier list for people who are looking to PUG keys and get into as high of keys as they can. So in this tier list, we're going to value things a little bit differently. We're going to think about which healers are going to have the best time finding groups, possibly be able to carry their groups a little bit with their healing throughput, their damage, and their utility. So if you must scroll to the end of the video to check the tier list, go ahead, but you have to like the video first. I'm also going to wrap things up by telling you guys my plans for a main and my first alt in Dragonflight Season 2. So patch 10.1 doesn't really bring as many balance changes as we're normally used to in a major patch for healers, as a lot of the balance changes seem to come around in patch 10.0.7. A few specs are getting tuned up a bit though, and with new tier sets entering the fray, that can also shake things up a little. We also have the 25% healing nerf to consider, as well as a new dungeon pool and some new affixes. So we're going to use the current 10.0.7 meta as a basis for the tier list and go from there. Okay, let's start with the S tier. Resto Shaman has been on the rise for several weeks now, and whether we're talking extremely high level play or just a mid-level pug, Resto Shaman has all the tools to be an extremely good M+ healer. Good passive damage through Acid Rain, great healing throughput, and a diverse bag of healing cooldowns means you shouldn't really struggle to meet any healing checks that get thrown at you. Now looking at it in terms of a pug group, Shaman offers some really great advantages. You've got a super short cooldown kick with Wind Shear and Capacitor Totem and Thundershock for AoE CC. The amount of stops you can get out as Shaman to prevent dangerous casts and lock mobs down is pretty insane. You've also got Bloodlust, which can be helpful in finding groups. You've got your Reincarnate for whoopsies, Earth Elemental for tank whoopsies. In my opinion, Shaman is the hands down favorite for 5-man content right now, but I am going to stop short of saying that it's head and shoulders above the rest. Still, we will put it in the pole position of the S tier. Following that in my mind is Resto Druid. Druid is just super solid in 5-man content. Good throughput, great cooldowns, damage that's really easy to get out, and also really good survivability with Bark Skin and Bear Form. You've got a B-Res, which is nice, but maybe not as big of a deal right now with Ret and Prot Paladins in seemingly every group. You still have a lot to offer in the utility department with the ability to spec into a Kick, In-Cap Roar, Soothe, Typhoon, Vortex, and Stampeding Roar as necessary. You've also got great mobility and the tried and true method of breaking any movement impairing effects by shapeshifting. Druid may not have the raw damage output as Resto Shaman, but it does respectably well in both AoE and single target, and has some of the easiest passive damage to get out in the game. I just feel like Resto Druid is a really safe pick for pugs, and while it may not be A+ across the board like Shaman, it has very few shortcomings and can handle most situations without the help of another particular spec. Let's also not forget Mark of the Wild. Giving the entire group 3% verse is something you can't overlook from a damage and defensive standpoint. The Druid 4 set seems really good for healing throughput, but you also have to consider that tying Nature's Vigil to Flourish and getting that extra 16 seconds of 40% Flourish effectiveness is going to be a damage buff as well. I think Druid is definitely behind Shaman, but still going to be a top performer, so I'm going to put it in the second spot of the S tier. Alright, next up I'm going to talk Preservation Evoker. Unfortunately, Evoker has been the target of a lot of nerfs recently and has seen its M+ popularity fall off. However, I would put it in a very similar place as Resto Druid, except probably a little bit further down the ladder. Evoker's healing throughput is still solid, its damage is incredibly easy to get out, but without instant living flames from the 10.04 set, the playstyle is definitely going to slow down a bit, and that damage isn't really being made up for anywhere else. Still, Evoker brings a lot of utility that's going to be very highly coveted by your group. Bloodlust, a kick, a knockup and knockback, the ability to dispel bleeds, and just absolutely fantastic cooldowns for 5-mans like Rewind, maybe the most pug-friendly healing cooldown in the game. I've heard a lot of talk about the 25% healing nerf being super good for Evoker, and while there is definitely some truth to that, I think the point is being overblown a bit. The only percent-based healing spells Evoker has are Golden Hour and Rewind. In the case of Rewind, yes, it's an amazing cooldown, and it got undeniably better. But remember that Golden Hour doesn't get full echo benefit from temporal anomaly echoes anymore, and while it will definitely benefit from the change, this idea that it got some massive buff to Evoker feels a little bit overhyped to me. Honestly, I'd kind of characterize Evoker as Druid Light, and for that reason, I'm going to drop it down a tier and put it at the front of the A tier. Let's get into Discipline Priest. Maybe I'm a little biased because I think Disc is just so much fun, but although it doesn't exactly fit the mold of a great PUG healer, I think some of its strengths might offset that a bit. Ever since the 10.0.5 changes, Disc has had the raw throughput needed to meet healing checks and keep their groups on their feet with proper planning. Disc is also capable of doing an absolutely silly amount of damage. The obvious downside is that Priest doesn't have a kick or a very good stop, as running into a group and psychic screaming can be tough to pull off at times. You also lack both the classic group getters, Bloodlust, and Battle Res. Now, you do bring Mass Dispel, which seems to have some tremendous uses in every dungeon pool, as well as PI. It's easy to overlook the effect of a well-timed PI, but used properly, it is an absolutely huge damage boost to your group. Another thing that gains value when health and damage are increased by 25% are damage reductions. So 2 charges of pain suppression for your squishy DPS and your super squishy self, as well as barrier for your entire group, gains some value. With shields and pain sup, Disc is definitely the tankier of the 2 priest specs. Now, finally, we've got Disc's tier set to consider, which is looking great for 5-man content. Not only is it going to save you mana and buff your Radiance considerably, but getting instant casts of Radiance can really smooth out and simplify that Disc rotation, especially during those Shadow Covenant windows. So while Disc has some obvious shortcomings as a plug-and-play healer, I feel that its strengths are just too good to ignore, and it does belong in the A tier behind Preservation Evoker. Alright, let's get into Holy Paladin. While I think Paladins will definitely be able to work in very high level keys, when we make a tier list, we are literally comparing it to all other healing specs and looking at the totality of Paladin's healing, throughput, and DPS. It's hard to make a case for it taking it over any of the aforementioned healers. I do think the Avenging Crusader rework has potential, but it feels like Holy Paladin is more than one single talent rework away from competing with the big dogs. B-Res, of course, is really helpful, but what's not helpful is the popularity of both Prot and Ret Paladins and Pug keys, and inviting that third pink class might be kind of a hard sell. The Paladin Force set also doesn't really seem to do much to solve the problems for a spec that really needs something to separate it from the pack, as more healers seem to be gaining more and more utility, and Paladin's typical plethora of utility doesn't feel as special as it used to, and it's not really picking up the slack anywhere else. So with all that said, I'm going to be putting Holy Paladin in the front of the B tier. Okay, I'm going to say a sentence and you tell me if you've heard it before. Mistweaver is getting some big improvements in the upcoming patch. Yeah, you've heard that before? What do you think will happen next? Okay, I don't want to be a negative Nancy, but at this point, I don't know if quality of life changes are enough to save this spec. I really like the Ancient Teachings changes, the reduced CD of Feline Stomp, the buff to Vivify, and although Monk does have some useful utility and also some really underrated damage, it feels like it's really hurt by the lack of the 2 big group getter spells, B-Res and Bloodlust, and much like Paladin, doesn't bring anything unique enough to make it rise above the rest. I also think Monk is suffering from an absolutely terrible case of community perception, and even when the day comes that Monk is finally super good, I worry that it's going to take a while for the community to accept this spec again. Now, with all that said, I do think Monk will close the gap a bit, and like Paladin, it's totally capable of healing very, very high keys. This is not the super imbalanced state of healing we saw at the beginning of Season 1, but I can't in good conscience recommend it as a great pug healer because I think you're going to have a really hard time finding groups. Finally, Holy Priest. As the only class with 2 healing specs, Priest always suffers from the fact that everyone's going to flock to one or the other, and the second spec will kind of be forgotten. Unfortunately, Holy seems to be that forgotten spec this expansion so far. Remember all the pug shortcomings we talked about with Disc Priest, no kick, no CC? Yeah, all that, but with less upside. Unfortunately, also squishy. AoE healing as a Holy Priest can also be a little sketch at times, but on the bright side, I do think the damage buffs and the Holy Priest 4 set are going to help Holy Priest a bit, and even though I'm placing it last on the tier list, doesn't mean I wouldn't recommend it to people. Holy has a very straightforward playstyle that a lot of players really enjoy, myself included, and it's capable of healing very high keys in my opinion, but both its damage and healing compared to Disc are a bit lacking. Alright, so after much consideration and playing a whole bunch of specs, I've decided on what I want to main and what I want to make my main alt for for Season 2. For a main, I'm going to go with Resto Druid. Although I did consider Shaman, I think Shaman's fun. I think Shaman's going to be incredibly good. Druid's just a little bit more my playstyle. I like the fast-paced, kind of spammy playstyle of Druid. I really like that you can cast pretty much everything on the move. I love the utility. I love the mobility. Druid just vibes with me. I think I'm a lot better at it. So I'm going to be maining Druid for Season 2. And then as a main alt, I'm going to go with Disc Priest. I just love playing the spec too much to not play it. I think it's going to be a challenge to learn a new dungeon pool on Disc for the first time, but it's just so much fun. It does so much freaking damage. I have so much fun with it. So I'm going to be going Resto Druid main, Disc Priest as my first alt going into Season 2. So how about you guys? What are you going into Season 2 with? How are you feeling about your spec and where they stand in the pecking order of healers right now? Let me know in the comments section. And if you made it this far, I always appreciate a thumbs up on the video. Helps me out a lot. You can also check me out here on stream on YouTube, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday nights, 9 p.m., where we stream all kinds of different Mythic Plus healing fun. I'd love to see you there. Until next time, guys, happy healing.